Welcome to John. Dobrodošli na promociju druge zbirke poezije Park u razgovoru sa Semezdinom Mehmedinovićem. Napominjem da knjige po promotivnoj cijeni možete kupiti u knjižari gdje će ih autor poslije potpisati. Sada slijedi kratki uradak animirani Nine Knežević u kojem ćete, nadam se, uživati, a poslije se vidimo u 7:30 na istom mjestu gdje će Almin Kaplan predstaviti Noćnu stražu Darka Cvjetića. Uživajte.
Evening, and thank you for coming. This is a second conversation, John Freeman and me, let's say in 3 days, and we just change seats. Now my turn is to ask questions, easy part. Again, in the same place. I like this by-book backyard. Beautiful. We need some air condition, but we'll survive. Again, we have a girls in audience, which is good. Yeah. And now I'll go with a short intro. John Freeman is known to the Sarajevo audience as a co-founder of this festival, Bookstan. But John Freeman is a very influential literary critic and editor. He was editor in Granta magazine, until recently executive editor in daily website, I have to check. LitHub, LitHub, very influential website. I already published something there, but I have a problem with the names, and I have to check there. And of course, John Freeman is an editor of Freeman's magazine, and from this year, editor in respectful publishing house, Knopf. Yeah, but as an editor, he is a special. Like he pay attention, equal attention for important writers from all around the world. Okay, in that sense, he reminds me of Susan Sontag. She used to introduce important writers from Latin America, from Europe, or from Asia to American publishers and American readers. And I saw that last issue of Freeman's magazine was translated to Italian, maybe in some other languages. It's so unusual for literary magazine to be translated. Okay, and that says something about the influence of Freeman's magazine. Above all, Freeman is author, poet with the two books. the maps, and the park. Tonight we'll talk a little bit about Park, published last year by Book in an excellent translation of Irena Zlov, and beautifully, but really beautifully designed and illustrated by Alexandra Nina Knežević, also known as Nina Machina. Okay. And John, I'll start with a bit from book design point and ask you something, personal. Is it important for you how book looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember all the favorite books I own and have read. I remember the first time I read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. It was in an Atlas edition with this slightly hideous green cover, but big font. And it allowed you to read the book quickly, because the pages had 200 words on them. And it felt like you were rushing through this affair. It's a novel set in Paris about a man who doesn't realize he's bisexual, and he's come to the end of an affair with a man named Giovanni. And so he's remembering it and retelling it. And because the font is big, you pile through the book very quickly. So on a very simple level, the way that the text looks on the page is crucial. But that's especially true of poetry, where there aren't very many words on the page sometimes. And I've had the good fortune with Granta and with Freeman's of working with a very talented designer, Michael Salu, who designs the covers but also the interiors. And the font in Freeman's is larger than usual because I'm also a little bit blind now, so you all look perfect. So I think it's nice too when you can read it. But the book is an object, and it needs to remind you of that, I think. So I just want to say, if Nina Machina is here, I love this book. It's my favorite edition. There's only a couple, but it's my favorite of the Park. One of my favorite books growing up was The Little Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. And it has the same quality of the drawings, that it feels otherworldly, like it could take place on another planet. And I think sometimes, the Park is set in a park in Paris. It's the Jardin de Luxembourg. Any of you, once things get clearer, can go there if you can get there. It's a beautiful park. It's open to the public. But everyone who goes there is in their own individual park, just like all of you are, to some degree, in your own individual Sarajevo. Last night, a friend of mine I met on the first trip here 6 years ago took me around her Sarajevo, and we met at Hermosa and had a decent meal. And then we walked through the old town and then up the hill. And I don't drink, and so we went to a cafe where, it was mostly people from her Mahala. Is it Mahala? And we sat there, and she described going there, when she was a teenager with boys not holding hands because everyone would look, And it sounded like my neighborhood growing up, where you could think you were alone and you like hug someone, and your parents know before you get home. And you think it's like a kind of network. And so we're knitted together in space, but we're also very subjectively in that space. So I sort of wanted to write a book about that tension, because, capitalist culture teaches us, it entitles, it makes you think that you're kind of an emperor of choice. You're like, I will take that, if you live in certain places serviced by Amazon, it's making us into monsters of convenience. You know, I can order a book in New York City and have it by the end of the day. Someone's just rushing there. Here's your book, and then it sits there on my desk for a week, and I don't need it that fast. And so I think part of what is being lost in that is shared values, and one of the shared values that comes from not being completely and totally entitled is how to be in a space together and what it means to share the space and share the risk. And as I was writing these poems in the park, it was 2016, 2017, 2018, and Macron changed some of the immigration laws in France to make it more difficult for people migrating into France. The police, the immigration procedures were speeded up so that you had fewer days to prove your need for asylum. And then the police had doubled the amount of days to hold you without any judicial inquiry. I think it went from 45 to 90 days. So it became more unsafe for people who weren't legally there, you know. And also he shut down he made it impossible for other camps to be built around Calais and other places. And so in this park where I felt totally safe and at home, you know, I could sit there and just look at things. There were other people, especially in the morning, who were not safe, who didn't want to be seen, who were sleeping there or hiding. And so when it comes to sharing space, that's also part of ethical responsibility. And I didn't know what to do with the questions that shared space was posing to me. So that's why I started writing some of these poems.
Yeah, I thought maybe first I will ask you a few general questions, but you started with Luxembourg Garden already, and I will just explain a little bit. John Freeman lived in Paris in the last few years during the summer and winter, and his place was a block from Luxembourg Garden. And he spent a lot of time in that park, and the result of that time is a book. Book is a park, and maybe we can go a little bit more with the park, and at the end we'll go to general questions. Maybe you can, for the beginning, you know, read a few poems, and then we'll start to talk.
Okay, great. Yeah. It's really nice to be talking to Semezdin because he wrote a book called 9 Alexandrias, which is, I think, the most interesting work of poetry to emerge in the U.S. Out of the September 11th. It's a sort of road trip, if you will, across the United States in a time period where many people in the U.S. were as threatened as some of the people who were in the park that I'm writing about, for different reasons, but often having to do with their perceived or actual background, their perceived or actual religion, and these spasms of intolerance. I think sometimes the hardest questions are put to the people who have the most amount of freedom. Because the test the system is presenting to you is, what will you do if we do this, and it doesn't affect you? Perhaps it might be a clearer choice if someone you love is affected, but if it's not someone you know, what does that mean? And I think the challenge of literature now is to write specifically into some of these questions without making propaganda out of it, and without making a commodity of empathy. You know, the generalized empathy is almost useless. You know, it's like generalized happiness. It doesn't exist. You know, happiness is produced specifically by specific people and experiences, unless it's a drug, and then, you know, good luck with that. But I'm not as young as this gesture will be. I left my poems at home, so I'm going to read off my phone like a millennial. Let's see. Sorry, I gotta scroll here back to the poem I was going to read. So as Semezdin mentioned, the apartment that I stay in Paris. Don't worry, I'm not Bill Gates. It's someone else's apartment, and I rent it very cheaply. But it's beautiful because it's right on top of the park, and it's right next to Saint-Sulpice, this beautiful church. And one of the things I love about certain churches is their attitude towards caring for people who need care. And this church, for whatever reason, if there's someone sleeping there, someone always brings them food. But it's not always someone from inside the church. So this is something I saw one day. Charity. Oops. It's so weird to hear my voice. In the mouth of the church, 2 men and 3 women picnic away from the rain. A man in rags beside them sleeping. Before they plate sandwiches, cornichons, fresh pears, cold meats. A piece of bread is broken from the loaf. Wine poured into a red plastic cup. Placed by his body. Care taken not to waken him. I'll read this other poem. The park is, to me, sort of this park, but it's also a kind of metaphorical park that is connected to every park I've been in. And sometimes I step through a kind of wormhole into another park. The waltz. Tonight in the park, I was reminded of the first waltz I attended. Dancers turning across the floor in orchestration, lights low, the beauty of being young, trying not to be, in our dinner jackets and dresses, our parents' cars polished, parked outside, still ticking in the heat, unaware this dance was a rehearsal to what? It wasn't clear. The movement felt so free, endless, so much like the point around which the entire planet orbited, just as tonight, people strolled in twos in Paris, picnicking in groups, laughing with their tongues, lounging on chairs together, waiting for a chance dip in light like the lovers, entwined near the empty kiosk, cooled by mists set off every 10 minutes on timers. A hiss of water, meant for many, but now it's just them in the deep green shade of the trees, those chaperones of love's necessary discretion. Eventually, it will be all of us turning and turning out of a final cool night. We hope together or in twos, but it may be alone. We need each other to face that fact, even on a night like this.
Yeah, in your, yeah. In these poems, you describe you in a park, and you describe the interaction between people and the natural world. Okay, and maybe because of that, in the result, you have a lot of love poems. And from that point, I have important questions. I need you to answer me to that questions. You mentioned that we as humans today miss tenderness. Okay, I like that sentence. I want you to explore a little bit and to tell us something more about it.
I love that there's bird song through this. It's so nice. There's a number of reasons I think all of us miss it to some degree. We're emerging from this pandemic. And I was living in New York for the first part of it, and you literally couldn't touch people. You couldn't hug people. You know, you were supposed to be 6 feet away. You couldn't see people's faces. You know, and we need touch, I think. It was a bizarre year and a half for that reason alone. And sight is so often thought of as the primary kind of sense, you know, that we're just like this sort of telescope just zooming across. But I think, you know, smell and touch are equally powerful, you know, and mysterious, because sometimes you don't realize how important they are until you've been with someone that you're friends with, and you've been sort of touching their arm or putting your hand around them, or, you know, they've been slapping you on the back or the back of the head, depending on how good a friend they are. And it's all those things, I think, create our sense of shared reality, and it's intolerable to live in a world without them, you know. And on top of this, I think the last couple of years we've been in an environment where the loudest voices have been voices of the opposite of tenderness. They've all been arguing for the fact that tenderness is a weak value, you know, that we don't have enough time and energy and resources, money, as states, as organizations, to care for people we don't know, you know. And on top of that, at the most extreme nationalistic, you know, range of that register is that the people who seek to be amongst us, who are not from where we are, that they're stealing something, you know, that it is an invasion. You know, I don't need to name the names of the people speaking this way. We all know them. They've taken up way too much of our internal lives. And I don't need to talk much here about how that deforms language. You know, when language is being mangled and broken in front of you and chopped up into smaller qubits of meaning, and that those qubits are all basically telling you the same thing, that, you know, it's just us. You know, you alone don't have enough resources to care for anybody else. You know, it makes it hard to love. You know, Allen Ginsberg has a great poem called Wichita Sutra Vortex that is about driving to a poetry reading in Wichita in 1964. And in 1964 was the year that Emmett Till was murdered, and his picture was used by his mother in Jet magazine, which was a magazine primarily for black readers. And he was really brutally murdered, and she wanted everyone to see his picture. 1964 also was just a violent year. There was assassinations. This is when the police were using fire hoses on protesters. You know, it took the violence and virtual torture, I think, to wake up white Americans to what was being done in their name. And so Ginsberg is driving to Wichita, Kansas. He's trying to think, how do we construct a we? How do we live and love kind of flagrantly in a time that's like this, which I think is very much like the time we're living in right now. Certainly for me, living partly in the United States. And he has this line that all our language is taxed by war. And I think this is true. And so we need tenderness. Tenderness is as a value and as a lexicon. Tenderness as a language is damaged by the environment in which we live in, and how do you reassert it? You know, and so part of these poems is trying to figure out, can I write about love while someone is sleeping next to me who's homeless? You know, what would Neruda's love poems be like if he was also writing about poverty? You know, and is it possible to do in the same poems? Does the desire for love, does longing for touch, does it belong in the same poem as sympathy, as compassion? And that's one of the questions I'm trying to figure out with these poems.
Yeah, like question you ask is how we live together, actually. But you know, you mentioned Macron, the Luxembourg Garden, and all probably parks in Paris. They are free for all. You're open for all. And when Macron was elected, he changed that rule and he excluded refugees. Can you talk a little bit more about, please?
Yeah, I mean, the rule went into effect and had an almost instant impact on the park because people who were there were suddenly hiding or no longer there. And one of the very peculiar aspects of this time period was that while this rule was going into effect, there was a photographic exhibit on the that was installed on the outside of the park on the walls of photographs of Syrian migrants leaving war zones. And so the park was telling you, come in, enter, enjoy yourself. But it was also on the outside saying, you too are compassionate. And I think one of the things all of us must struggle with, I know I do, is compassion a useless value if it doesn't lead to action? Because there are many ways in which a photograph, and you mentioned Susan Sontag, she wrestled with this her whole life. You know, so do the birds. No, I think to them it's like open mic. But Sontag wrote a book called On Photography, and then she wrote a book on regarding the pain of others.
Important book for Sarajevans.
I think it's a brilliant, beautiful, powerful book. And On Photography, I think
one of the best about photography.
But it also, I think in that she had become slightly cynical of the value of a photograph to move people, because she felt like we lived in an environment in which we encounter so many images that it doesn't matter. You're scrolling. It's like dog, nice outfit, war zone picture. And this was before Instagram. But then towards the end of her life and on regarding the pain of others, she believed that it could make a difference. And I tend to agree, but I think literature can help us make that possible if it pays attention to the messaging of the world we live in. And so part of this book, what I was trying to do is not create the Museum of Paris, like people with stripy shirts in cafes, with, croissant dust on them, making out in parks, listening to people playing accordions, while getting in a Duchevaux, Renault and driving off to a black and white movie, under the moonlight with the Eiffel Tower behind them. Like, to me, that's the image that Paris sells you as a visitor sometimes. And I think the Paris of actuality is far more interesting.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit back to your first answer. You mentioned our sense of place, okay? And reading your book, I thought about my own sense of space. I never had a place in which I will go, during the day to escape from my daily routine, okay? And stay there for half hour or 10 minutes, and reconnect with myself and with the world. I never had that. From time to time, I found it in the public places, in the restaurant, and I thought Luxembourg Park was probably that space for you. I called that space a zone. partially because I thought about Apollinaire and Apollinaires' poem Zone during the process of reading, probably because of Paris images and can we call this zone? And how you see that space in not park as a space?
I love those poems, the Apollinaire poems. Semezdin and I had a coffee when I first arrived, and we were talking about these poems. And part of what made me want to go to Paris was reading all these Parisian poets. And then I realized that most of them were misanthropic to an almost slightly vile degree. You know, Baudelaire, Rimbaud. You know, I wouldn't want to be in a cafe with them. They'd be sitting there just looking at me. You know, and I think they didn't like crowds. You know, there's a point at which their language gets very close to that sort of anti-Semitic language that says crowds, the cities are dirty. You know, it's very close to what language in Austria was sounding like at the turn of the 20th century. But Apollinaire has this kind of spirit that's like a kite. You know, he can kind of float in ways. And partly, he seemed like more of a open flaneur, you know, and I realize this is slightly dated. If you're interested in writing about walking and zones, there's a very good book by Lauren Elkin called Flaneuse, which is about women walking in Paris and other places. And she writes about Gertrude Stein and others, women who have equally made Paris their own. I grew up in the West, you know, and the zone was the car. Not a very dramatic zone. But to do and go anywhere, you had to get in a vehicle, you know, and drive. But once I was in Sacramento, you left Sacramento, the spaces opened up, you know, and it took me a long time to get uncoupled from the car. I love cars. Part of me right now longs for a car, you know. It's my alternate existence, is to have a 1964 Ford Falcon convertible, you know, with a dog and a gas tank and no responsibilities, you know. And I know it starts to sound like a Budweiser ad, you know. But I think there's a drama and kind of vaulting beauty to the West. The sky is bigger, the colors are psychedelic, you know. The desert is challenging and interesting. But driving from Sacramento west, you go to San Francisco, you know, and there's not a whole lot of drama except for rice fields, foothills, and then sort of San Francisco rising like a mirage. And San Francisco was the first city I walked around heavily, you know, without a car. First because my parents took me there, and my dad he's like a goat. He's 82 now, and I went to go see him 2 years ago, and we're walking around. He spends half of his year in the Midlands in England because his wife is English by descent. We're walking around, and he's showing me Roman aqueducts and Roman buildings and Roman ruins and, you know, cathedrals. Suddenly, I'm really tired. Dad, I have to lay down. So we finally get back to his place, and I look at my phone, and we've walked 14 miles. And my dad is 82. He was 80 then. But when we were going to San Francisco as kids, he would want to walk up and down the hills and around and everywhere. And I saw things then because we weren't in the car. And some of it was great. It was San Francisco, if you've never been there, every corner is sort of curated to present the bay to you. You know, the water, the bridge, the fog. And it's a very beautiful city. It's also got a mercantile quality shops and things, which is unlike any city in California. It's made for walking. not for driving. But then there's also, San Francisco has one of the biggest homeless populations in the United States. So as a 11-year-old walking around San Francisco, I was really freaked out. I thought, what is happening here? Like, why are these people on the street, you know? And this was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. So people had, you know, the very visible effects of HIV and AIDS infections. People were destitute in a psychotic way. And that was my first experience of being in a zone, you know, where the zone is not a curated space where everything is left out. A zone is, to me, a space of movement and engagement, you know, where you are touched by the things around you as well as you're looking at it and traveling through it.
Wow, that's good. You offer us American landscape in a perfect way, and I have a lot of questions. But the first one, I thought about a short note or prose poem I wrote like 10 years ago, comparing Sarajevo's parks and DC parks. And the difference is, you know, like in Sarajevo's park you can hear, you know, kids smiling, okay, young couples with the babies, a lot of kids in the parks. That's how I saw park. In DC I never saw kids, okay, in DC parks. I never saw kids. And maybe Manhattan was different. And you mentioned that, you know, like Luxembourg Garden was a park for you. And when you think about Luxembourg Garden, you think about all parks from your experience. And can you compare, let's say, European parks and American parks? You start a little bit with description of San Francisco.
Well, I'm talking about cities because of your question about zones, but I think parks and cities share things in common, one of which is a park is a concept. You know, basically it's an assumption that you need more green around you than a city will provide. And a city is a concept too, which is the idea that, you know, we live better together than separately. And so the cities are an actuality, but they're also a concept, and the concept of a city is important. And lately, the American concept of parks is changing a little. You know, I think because of the damage that cars and vehicle traffic has done to the environment, there's an urban greening movement to try to make parks more accessible, to make them more palatable to Americans. But frankly, it often means to make them places to exercise in. So during the pandemic, I used to go to the water and walk from my apartment in Chelsea down to the new World Trade Center. And I can't live in Manhattan without seeing the water. There are a lot of birds over there, like falcons, eagles. And you can see things. You have a new horizon. But during the pandemic, as soon as the lockdown was sort of slightly eased, people were going stir crazy. So they all went to the West Side Park, and they were running. It was like people with their shirts off, like sweat, just, you know. And I'm 46, and suddenly I realized that the difference between being 46 and 26, which is that I slightly resented everyone with their shirt off. Like, what are you doing with your shirt off here? Just sweating profusely, you know. It's totally unnecessary. Go get a tan on your roof, you know. And so I became this sort of grumpy, older than I am man, sort of walking around. But I joke, but in truth, that this value of usefulness, you know, like is part of what that park became, because it's like, I can't be outside unless I'm exercising. You know, partly because people are getting stressed, but partly because it's like, I must be exercising. So they go to the park and they use it for exercise. And so you don't see kids, you know, and even in Central Park in New York, you don't see as many kids as you would in a normal park here. And so in Paris, when I'm in the Luxembourg Gardens, there are people of all ages. There are people close to 100 years old. There are lots of couples. There are people making out in public for hours. You know, it never escalates. That's what this very strange thing about the French makeout session. It's just like a 3-hour kiss. I think surely at some point, like they're going to think, okay, let's just take this to the next level, you know? But no, they just stay there. And then they get kicked out of the park and they don't look sad. I think that was not my experience being young. But I think you need to be around people of all ages, you know. And we live so much now online, and it, you know, my Instagram search function, you know, when you go to look something up, and it shows you what you've been looking at, and mine is dogs and horses, you know, and that's all it thinks I want to look at. It's like, do you want a dog and a horse together? Woo, you know, and if you go online and if you like something on Twitter, or if you forward something, it's just going to give you more of that, you know. And so basically, if you spend enough time there, pretty much you end in this endless cycle towards like 5 things. It's like, I hate Donald Trump. Dogs are good. Nazis pretty much bad. Also, you know, I like horses, and that's all I see on Twitter, and occasional literary news. And so a park has to be open to all people, but it also has to have everyone there, because I think otherwise you end up in this segment. And you were describing, you know, when we were talking before, how Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the publisher of City Lights and great poet, sometime photographer, how in his 80s he seemed young. And I'm convinced that's because he spent a lot of time with young people. Like you go to City Lights and yeah, they're the people with the berets, and it's still 1967. And, you know, maybe they live in Mendocino now, not in San Francisco, and they own a Volvo rather than ride a bicycle. But, you know, Ferlinghetti was young at heart. He was fundamentally revolutionary. He believed in the power of each new generation of youth culture. And I think I'm slightly off topic here about parks and people, but I do think if older people are deprived of younger people, and as younger and middle-aged people are deprived of older people, you end up in this distorted world. And I teach students now, and I'm shocked sometimes. They're graduate students at very good university, and they've never heard of Saul Bellow. You know, and I don't think Saul Bellow hung the moon, but it's like, really? You know, I taught a class and I taught Midnight's Children. No one had read it. I think, how is this possible? I taught a Toni Morrison book, and most people had read one. You know, greatest American novelist of the last 100 years, maybe. And people had read one of her books, and there's about 11 of them. So I think the contextlessness of American life that I live in is very worrying, because I live and I spend time with people who are proud of their sense of context and history and culture, and even that is on the wane.
Well, okay, looks like we are now talking about Western world. It reminds me of. Sorry, I forgot mic. We are talking about Western world now, and I thought about poem from a book with the title "Why Paris is Not West." Why Paris? I think amazing poem, just 4 lines. I have never stood in the hollow of a tree at Luxembourg Garden and heard train telling me you could be elsewhere. I like this last line. I like poem. If you can, just to explain a little bit background of this poem, maybe this last line, but also this book is a book about park and book about your Paris. Can you tell us something more about your Paris?
Velocity is an American value, speed, you know, and it just means that everything, you know, there was a movie called Vanishing Point from 1970, 1971. I recommend you see it, but maybe do some Quaaludes before you watch it, because it's a movie about a guy who drives a car across the country, and the drive has no purpose, and it's being narrated in sort of jive by a DJ, and eventually he's pursued by law enforcement for reasons that's unclear. And it's almost like a performance art piece, because there's no character, there's no value, there's nothing happening on an intimate personal level. It's just, I must get there, I will travel there as fast as possible. And one of the things I really love about Paris and this park in general is it's designed to make you slow down. That park, a good park is, I think. It's like it gives you very different places to sit down. It's the reason why picnics occur to you. It's like, oh, instead of walking and eating at the same time, which has probably never occurred to any of you. But believe me, as an American, if I have a piece of food in my hand, I think I could walk and eat this. You know, we just had a coffee, and 30% of my brain was thinking, I could walk and drink this, and we could have a walk and drink coffee at the same time. So I love the parks because they nurture solitude and contemplation. And I'm not a religious person, although I like that people have faith. You know, to me, a park is like a church that's open to anybody, and it's outdoors. You know, and it also reminds us of connections we have to other living things, you know, birds, small animals and rodents, insects. They're all there in the park with us. And if you sit there long enough, they make themselves known. And it's very strange to suddenly realize that they have no sense that this is your park. You know, they're just going about doing the things that they normally do, looking for food, maybe someone to spend the night with, or although I think some birds spend the whole life with each other. So I think in many ways a park is very close to what poetry should be. You know, I think a novel depends to some degree on momentum and propulsion. You know, it needs to have a pace. It has to have some ideas and some inquiry, but if it doesn't have momentum, it dies. Whereas a book of poems or hybrid forms can create a space for you to simply exist in a better form of thoughtfulness. And I don't know, I think I personally need that every day.
It's interesting. I have a few questions, and I have to jump from a park and from a Paris now. You mentioned San Francisco, and I read your beautifully written text published a few months ago in Paris Review. In that text, you describe your first visit of San Francisco. It happened in the 80s. And also you describe your visit to City Lights bookstore. You were young there, but with a clear interest for poetry. Okay. And now I want to bring you in the 80s and ask which were poets that you choose as important at that time. And also, I want to know which poets are important for you today.
One of the reasons why I read Semezdin is I picked up Sarajevo Blues in City Lights, which was published by City Lights in the 90s. And to me, it's a, you know, I hope this is, take this in the most unsacrilegious way, but to me, going to City Lights is the Hajj. You know, I feel like there is a sacredness to how it treats literature and poetry that I cannot express. I can only describe that the experiences I've had there are revelatory. I grew up in a very provincial town, Sacramento. I read probably 6 or 7 American writers, and City Lights is a place full of literature from around the world in translation, from East Africa, from Turkey, from Bosnia, from the Far East. It's got a basement that's full of literature that's questioning, you know, all the fundamental myths of American life. They have a section called Stolen Continent. It's not American history. It's called Stolen Continent. They have a section about economics called Dreams of Capitalism. You know, so this is the kind of place it is, and I can't stress to you enough the amount of messaging one gets growing up in the United States that goes opposite to those thinking patterns. So this was a big deal to me to go there, and my parents, for whatever reason, just left me there. So I spent all this time upstairs in the poetry section, and they have a series called Pocket Poets. You know, it's about the size of my hand, and they've published in that Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and a really wonderful Nicaraguan poet, Daisy Zamora, who I bought there, and Semezdin in 2003. And so I brought home Howl. You know, this sounds like such a American story, but I brought home Howl and read it, and that started my journey in caring about poetry. And in that age, teenager age, yeah, it was the beat poets, but also William Carlos Williams. I don't know if any of you have parents like this, but my dad was convinced I was gonna start swearing. He's convinced I was gonna be a fuck up. You know, that I was gonna be one of those people like that. I gave no signs of being this person, but he was gonna get out in advance of the screw up just in case. So as a teenager, I was reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer in my summers, not what a 14-year-old wants to read. I was reading William Faulkner. I was reading John Kenneth Galbraith, economics. And so I was desperate not to be on this great books program. And so at some point I said, I want to be a doctor, just to like get off of some of these books he was making me read, because he thought I was going to be an idiot. And so we went, there was one bookstore in Sacramento, one called Tower Records and Books, which tells you how much books they had. But there was a William Carlos Williams book sticking out, and I had found nothing, because, you know, by that point I had read Ginsberg, but there was no Ginsberg or anything there that looked like fun. The only thing I took off the shelf before he found me was Anais Nin's Delta of Venus, you know, which had sex on every page. So I was sitting there furtively reading this stuff, and he found me, and he said, "What about this? The doctor stories. You want to be a doctor?" And he basically sent me back into poetry with this, because William Carlos Williams is a brilliant poet, sort of American modernist, but he was also a full-time practicing physician, and he wrote his poems on prescription pads, which is why they're so skinny and sometimes short. But he also wrote short stories about being a doctor, and they're imagistic and powerful. And I can still remember one of them that I read when I was 14, 15, and it's about him going to a house and treating someone who's been sort of disfigured by jaw cancer, and she dies in the night. And the image of that was just so shocking, you know, and the way that he narrated it and what it's like to go to try to save someone and fail. So that had a huge impact on me. But obviously that was 29 years ago, and I've read a lot of poets since then, and I don't want to keep you here in your chairs forever, but to me, one of the exciting things is not just having favorite poets, but just this endless discovery of new poets, you know? There was a poet I read a couple months ago, maybe in the last year and a half, named Taya Tibble. It was a poet from New Zealand. And she has the kind of Walt Whitman, America's sort of, great poet, Song of Myself. He had this phrase called the barbaric yawp, W-A-Y-A-W-P. And he took that as just a way to kind of break American poetry out of its straitjacket. That I'm alive and I'm an animal. He was also gay, and he was going to just sing the song of himself, and he'll just sort of sound his barbaric yawp. And Taya Tibble has that too. She's an indigenous poet, and she writes about love and desire and sex, but she's in Wellington, and she is trying to grapple with some of the myths that are projected onto her. And I don't deal with these myths, I'm not an indigenous woman in New Zealand, but the style with which she does it, and the verve, and the way that she can swerve between camp, like a drag queen almost, and deep, poignant intimacies is really startling, and it creates this centripetal force where you don't know where she's going, and so you're just holding on to every single word of hers. And she's 25. Her poem is the first book is called Pocahontas, which is she was born the year that Disney's Pocahontas was made. So I love that poetry is constantly renewing itself, and I also love that they're cross-national affinities, and your work, I feel, I also hear some of my favorite poets like Jack Gilbert or Thomas Tranströmer, the great Swedish poet, and sort of psychological acuity and depths. I also love Wisła Szymborska, for the oddity of her intimacy. It's like, just when you think it's like this really sweet and direct grandmother talking to you across the kitchen table, her poems kind of turn and get a little dark. And I like poets like that who don't give you the expected.
Yeah, you mentioned Jack Gilbert. Jack Gilbert, amazing American poet, in love with the Mediterranean. He spent a lot of times in Greece and Italy. And that was a time when American writers used to travel, more, I think, than in last 2 or 3 decades. And I think traveling have huge impact on American literature of 20th century. And you are a traveler, and can you tell something about impact about traveling around the world on your writing?
It's made me want to write, for starters, and it's completely changed my frame of reference for what writing can be and how it maybe operates. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mentioned Thomas Tranströmer, who spent most of his life in Stockholm. He was a child psychologist, but also going to this island. There's many. Stockholm is like surrounded by an archipelago of hundreds of islands, and his grandfather was a sea captain, and he had a house on one of them called Runmaro. And his books are filled with an ecological kind of complexity of that island, from its seasonal feel to the birds that were there, to the kind of certain blue-black color of darkness that comes in a very northern place in winter. And there's a starkness to his poetic style that's slightly influenced by Americans, because he had a long relationship with Robert Bly, the translator and poet. And Bly was a kind of burly Midwesterner who came from Norwegian roots and who took on an interest in translation, and through his own magazine, which was called the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1960s, 1950s and the 50s, 60s and the 60s and the 70s and the 70s. I think he got to the 80s and was like, okay, that's it, I'm done. He's still alive. But Transtromer read through Bly a lot of Americans, and in that time period, some of them, like Adrian Rich, who was breaking out of formalism, and W.S. Merwin, started dropping punctuation. And so the poems have to speak to you in a language that moves almost without hinges, you know. And there's a real beauty to that when it's done well. And I interviewed Transtromer a few years before he died, and he had had a catastrophic stroke, so he was aphasic and paralyzed on the left side of his body, and he could say one or two words, yes or no. And then very good, that was his third phrase. That was it. And his wife, who was also a very accomplished social worker, was his conductor or interpreter. So they also, he also only mostly spoke Swedish, so I would ask my question in English, and she would then rephrase it in Swedish to him. And then he would make a kind of enormous variety of expressions. And then he would say, no. And then she would turn to me and say, I don't think I will be writing poetry again. I find that haiku is very successful at describing the brevity of life. And I was thinking, what the hell just happened? But one of the things I learned through that interview and through reading Transtromer's poetry, which was so connected to its specific zone, was the way that you can transmit senses of a place and intimacy in poetry that maybe is stripped free of punctuation. And in reading that poetry and seeing him, I started to look around and see what other Americans were doing that. And actually one of the best was not Merwin. It was a poet named Lucille Clifton, who's one of the best, I think, poets of the last 50 years, and is very good in writing about love. She too can move a line without punctuation better than I think almost any of them. And she was published by Random House, and Toni Morrison was her editor before Toni Morrison became a novelist. And so one small thing is that traveling makes me encounter people, but it also makes me re-encounter where I'm from. And I think enlarges the capacity of what I'm capable of seeing in my own domestic sphere.
Well, like they are alarming me that we are close to end, but I have 10 more questions. And I like this place, you know. I will address one. I mean, you know, I really I need more time. And I will address a question to you as a editor. You know, like your American publisher was Copper Canyon Press, and they're exclusively dedicated to poetry, which is unusual and probably possible in a big book market like American. And I remember co-founder of Copper Canyon Press, Sam Hamill, who was so obsessed with the poetry, and it's hard to find today people obsessed with the poetry. Okay, in a way, poetry was on a margin little bit, and that's the reason why asking you, where is the poetry in the publishing world?
I think it's always on the margin. You know, I think Homer was probably on the margin. You know, he was probably just yelling his poems at towns where people were doing other things. And they're like, the wine dark sea. It's like, shut up. Your poem is too long. So I think exciting things happen on the margin because you can see a lot more from the margin than when you're at the center of things. In American life now, I think there's structural changes underway in how poetry and literature is published, but also in how the country thinks of itself. And as a result of that, because the demographics are changing, who's at the center of discussions. And so there are more poets of color, more women, more gay poets, and there's an organization in America called Cave Canem, which has been sort of helping run classes and workshops for young black poets. And right now, it's a Harlem Renaissance without a Harlem. Some of the most exciting poets in America, Terrence Hayes, Robin Cost Lewis, Evie Shockley, they're black poets. And there's, you know, you can see what's happening with Black Lives Matter, but it's not only about justice and brutality and fighting against it. It's about joy, it's about different forms of music, it's about, sometimes they're Mandarin poets, you know, who really don't want to address the blackness as a concept. They reject it because it's a concept that was invented by whiteness. So it's a thrilling time in America to be a poet. And one of the things I really love about this present moment is how many different sounds of American poetry there are. You know, there's me, but there's dozens and dozens and dozens of other poets who are singing their own various tunes. And so some of them actually, like there's a poet named Ocean Vuong, who wrote a book called Night Sky with Bullet Wounds. He was born in Vietnam and grew up in America. And it's a beautiful series of love poems, but also elegies for the father he never really got to know. And that book sold almost 100,000 copies. So, you know, we've lost many great poets in recent years. Adrienne Rich, Ferlinghetti, Jack Gilbert, a whole generation of poets in 5 years died. But there's many, many new poets, and you know, they come from backgrounds into poetry, from spoken word, from theater, from performance art. That means that, you know, they're a lot more exciting on the page and also in person. And so it's a great time, I think, in American poetry. And you know, even though it's in the so-called margins, it's actually selling.
Well, I like your answer. Thank you for that. Now it's time for warm applause. Yeah. And if anybody wants to ask a question, now it's time.
May I ask something?
Yes.
It's about park, but I'm just connecting Louis Glip and garden with the park.
Yeah, Louise Glick, the American poet who recently won the Nobel Prize, has written some beautiful poems about a garden. And the difference between a garden and a park is you have a hand in growing a garden, whereas a park is a public space where maybe you furtively plant something on the side, but in general, you're sort of walking into an already created public space. And so for me, there's also a question of dominion, you know, over nature. Where in a garden, if you're a certain kind of gardener, you're controlling. You're trying to build an atmosphere and a world. But I think the best gardeners accept that they don't have dominion. They're working in consort with the natural world. Whereas in a park, your dominion is very limited. You know, you're accepting what's there and you're moving with the systems. And for me, that's one of the reasons why I chose a park versus a garden, is I was interested in questions of citizenship and collectiveness. Whereas a garden can be a place only for you, or you and a few other people. And I think Louise Glick, if you haven't read her, is a wonderful poet. And she has a kind of brutal precision as a poet. There's the pounds per square inch on each one of her lines is much higher than mine, because I come from a background of writing prose. And so I have a more, I think, a looser sound as a poet. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. John, thank you so much for all your answers.
I want to thank Amila, who was here but left because I was boring, who started Bookstan with Dahmer and brought me here 6 years ago, and Ida, who edited this book, and Irene Zloff, who translated it, and Layla, who worked on it, and Nina, who illustrated it, and Sem for asking me these questions. It's books of, my name's on the outside, but I feel immensely honored to be on stage with you. I think you're an amazing, profound writer. I think it will take me the rest of my life to appreciate what you've done. But I also think that coming here and being welcomed as a family member is one of the most rewarding and moving experiences of my life, and I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Mehdi.